On the 21st of September, in the year 1522, the first complete German New Testament came off the press in Wittenberg. Its translator was Martin Luther, the most famous man in Germany. And in the preface to its final book, he made a confession that still surprises readers. The Revelation of John, he wrote, he found neither apostolic nor prophetic. The man who gave Europe the Bible in its own language could not yet trust the last book in it. He called it obscure, image-laden, full of things he could not square with the gospel. That is where the story of Luther and Revelation begins, not in certainty, but in doubt. Luther's complaint against Revelation was not casual. The book seemed to teach salvation by works. Blessed are they that keep the sayings of the prophecy. It was full of dragons and beasts and numbers that yielded no plain word of Christ. And so, in the September Testament, Luther ranked it below the other books. Valuable, he conceded, but in his judgment neither apostolic nor prophetic. This was the honest verdict of a man whose whole theology rested on the clarity of Scripture. He was not alone in the judgment. Erasmus had doubted the book's apostolic authorship, and even Eusebius, the father of church history, had questioned its place in the canon. For the young reformer, a book that did not preach Christ plainly had no apostolic authority. Revelation stood before him as a locked door. The key that opened the door was not found in Revelation at all. It was found in Daniel and in Paul. The little horn that made war with the saints and prevailed, the man of sin who exalts himself in the temple of God, the beast whose number is the number of a man. Luther began to see that these were not three riddles but one figure, and that the figure had a seat, the throne of the papacy. He had first spoken the suspicion at the Leipzig debate in 1519, where the champion of Rome, Johann Eck, forced him to declare that the papacy was not of divine right, a concession that echoed across Europe. When the Pope claimed power over princes, over councils, over the souls of the faithful, Luther saw the blasphemy of the beast taking shape in his own century. The book that had seemed closed was, he now saw, an exposure of the power he was fighting. In 1530, Luther published the December Testament, and a new preface to Revelation, longer and more confident than the first. He did not retract his old doubts so much as answer them. The book, he now wrote, is above all a revelation of Jesus Christ. Its purpose is to warn the church against the false church. He told his readers to accustom their eyes to the dragon, the beast, and the harlot, for these were not distant monsters but present powers. The beast of the 13th chapter was, in Luther's plain words, the papacy. The man who had once dismissed the book now declared it indispensable. The apocalypse, he said, was the revelation of the Antichrist. Between 1522 and 1534 the Wittenberg New Testament was reprinted again and again, carrying the new preface into thousands of German homes, so that the reading of Revelation as history traveled with the gospel itself. Luther brought the same historicist key to the Old Testament. In his lectures on Daniel, he traced the four kingdoms of the prophet's vision through the ages: Babylon, Persia, Greece, and Rome, and he asked who the little horn was that rose among the 10, that spoke great words against the Most High, that wore out the saints of the Most High. His answer was the answer of the whole Reformation, the Roman See. Luther did not read Daniel as a curiosity of the ancient world. He read it as a chronicle of the Church's own age, in which the power of Rome had grown from a bishopric into a monarchy over the conscience. The second chapter of Paul's second letter to the Thessalonians became Luther's most used proof. There Paul described the man of sin, the son of perdition, who opposes and exalts himself above all that is called God, sitting in the temple of God and showing himself to be God. Luther measured the papacy against that description point by point: the claim to supremacy over all churches, the claim to bind consciences, the claim that the Pope can never err. The temple of God, he argued, is the church, and in the church the man of sin had taken his seat. In 1537 he wrote the conviction into the Smalcald Articles. The Pope, he declared, is the very Antichrist. Revelation 13, Luther taught, describes the same power from another angle. The beast from the sea speaks blasphemies, who is like unto the beast. And the papal court, Luther observed, spoke in exactly that voice, taking to itself the titles of Christ, the keys of heaven, the crown of the empire. The Pope, he wrote, was not the servant of the servants of God but a power that had set itself in the place of God. In his final years, in the treatise against the Roman Papacy, Luther's language became almost volcanic. The book he had once doubted had become, in his hands, the sharpest weapon of the Reformation. Not every mystery of Revelation yielded to Luther's key. The 20th chapter, with its binding of Satan for 1,000 years, had long been read by some as a future earthly kingdom of the saints. Luther rejected that reading outright. The 1,000 years, he taught, began with the coming of Christ, the strong man bound, the gospel going forth, the church ruling in patience, not in palaces. He mocked the enthusiasts who promised a visible reign of glory, the chiliasts of Münster who built a kingdom with the sword. For Luther, the binding of Satan was the age of the church itself, and the loosing of Satan lay near its end. Luther's apocalyptic map had two frontiers. In the west, the Antichrist, the papacy, corrupting the church from within. In the east, the Turk, the armies of the Ottoman Empire at the gates of Europe, which Luther and his age read as the Gog of the prophets and the final assault of the nations. In 1529, while he was preparing the new edition, the armies of Suleiman stood before the walls of Vienna. The prophecy of Gog seemed to be knocking at the gates of the west. Between the two, the Church of the Last Days stood in the middle of history. This was no academic scheme. Luther believed the sixth trumpet had sounded and the last age had begun. The book of Revelation was not a prediction to be dated in the far future, it was the news of his own time. Like the fathers and the medieval witnesses before him, Luther counted prophecy in history. The 1260 days of Daniel and Revelation he measured as years, stretching across the long reign of the Roman See. The power that had exalted itself in the 6th century was, in his judgment, already in its last age. He did not set a date, he refused to, again and again. But he believed the end was near, that the world would not last another century, that the judgment was at the door. That expectation gave the Reformation its urgency. If the beast was revealed and the last days had come, then the gospel must be preached to all the world without delay. What Luther began, a century of Protestant interpreters continued. Melanchthon carried the identification of the papacy with the Antichrist into the confessional documents of the Lutheran Church. The Magdeburg Centuries, the first great Protestant church history, was written to demonstrate from the records of the ages how the apostasy had grown. The historicist reading of Daniel and Revelation became the common inheritance of the Reformation, in the British Isles, in the Dutch churches, in the Puritan exiles. When later interpreters from Isaac Newton to William Miller took up the prophecies of Daniel and John, they stood on ground Luther had cleared, the conviction that the visions describe real powers in real history. It is one of the strangest turns in the history of interpretation. The man who first published Revelation in German confessed he could not call it apostolic. The same man, 8 years later, called it the revelation of the Antichrist and the indispensable warning of the Church. Luther never wrote the great commentary on Revelation that his followers hoped for. He did something greater. He gave the historicist reading back to the Church as a living conviction, that the beast is a real power, that the 1,000 years are the age of the Church, that prophecy is history and history is prophecy. The doubter had become the unsealer. This is the Unsealed, history through the lens of prophecy.